Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
So all that in our first of two programmes from the Labour Party conference today, here in the wonderful city of Liverpool. And joining me to take stock on the final day of conference are two political commentators who have been following proceedings, Gabby Hinsliff and Owen Jones. Welcome to you both. So Gabby, give me what's your overall impression of this conference?
It's been a weird mishmash of things going on. I mean, it's felt oddly as if the action was elsewhere all of the time, you know, as if that often happens in sort of opposition parties' conferences, but as if half the action was down the road at the Momentum Jamboree, I wouldn't know when to call it a conference, and only half of it was here. But we spent the whole week talking about unity and still struggling for evidence of that, I would say.
A weird mishmash?
Yeah, well, I think the problem is the way it was set up by the media is it'd be like a big pub brawl, and I think it's more that people are sitting on separate tables in the pub, probably. I think just maybe not. No, actually, but I think what's interesting is, and it sounds a bit contrarian, but I think, you know, the obvious reference point is the 1980s, massive divisions within the Labour Party, but there were far greater ideological differences back then. There were mainstream figures calling for the nationalisation of the top two monopolies. These days, there's actually on the actual issues quite a lot of unity. Investment in the economy, not cuts. Comprehensive education, not selection, you know, whether it becomes the public, you know, health services. It's not the great divisions. A lot of it is actually about tone, it's about posture often. And I actually think when you actually go through the issues, if you actually ask what are the main differences you have with the other side, people often don't quite know what to say.
Divide perhaps on immigration.
Well, immigration is interesting, isn't it? Because it doesn't necessarily cut left or right very easily. Traditionally, the most pro-immigration wing to the Labour Party, with a Blairite right, and the Labour left, but now you get the likes of Chuck Munna, I suppose on the right of the party, who was pro-immigration but saying that Labour needs to shift their position given where many Labour voters are. So that's complicated.
I apologise to our viewers, I think there's a little interference on the sound. I hope you can still hear us all right. I think you can. Just
it's probably a relief not to hear my babbling.
Not at all. It's never a relief. Isn't the problem they face today is that the conference began with the leadership announcement and then for calls of unity to rally around the new leader. But it could be finishing today, given what we understand Mr Corbyn is going to say about immigration, on a huge argument.
Yeah, and as Owen was saying, that's not just a Corbynite versus non-Corbynite argument. I think the interesting thing about this conference is that you see all sorts of divisions opening up that we've perhaps been ignoring because we were looking at the big one. This is a division between socially conservative Labour, which is your Labour heartland vote, you know, northern cities, Welsh valleys, people who, coalfield communities, former industrial, you know, post-industrial areas, which seem hostile to immigration or more hostile to immigration. You sort of stop any MP pretty much from one of those seats and they will say immigration comes up time and time again on the doorstep. We just do not have consent for the levels of immigration we have, and the Brexit vote just proved that. And the kind of liberal left part of Labour, the sort of North London part of Labour, which feels very differently about it. And I think, you know, that's a very, very difficult choice for all progressive parties, but it's much harder for Labour because there are a lot of Labour leavish voters, UKIP inclined, who are going to hate what he says today.
If he wants to heal the party on, why is he making no concession on immigration?
Well, I think that's a line he has to... I mean, for the reasons Gary just says, it's a very difficult line for him to tread because the Labour coalition is fragmenting over lots of issues. There are, in the big cities, as you say, London, Manchester, Birmingham, particularly younger voters, naturally Labour inclined, quite well disposed to immigration. If they hear what they think is anti-immigration rhetoric, then they'll go elsewhere or not vote. Then you get particularly older working class voters, particularly in small towns, who feel immigration is a threat, it causes insecurity and so on. And if they see something which is seen as too pro-immigration, then they certainly will go elsewhere. So I think the line he has to pursue is to emphasise that he understands people's concerns. Well, I grew up, not many immigrants, but there is lots of concerns about immigration. But what people feel often is insulted. They feel that politicians don't take their concerns seriously. I think what he has to say is, I know you have concerns, I understand them, I don't think you're racist or bigoted for having them, and that's why, front and central, I want a migrant impact fund which actually gives resources to areas with higher levels of immigration.
The size of which you can't tell us.
Well, I mean, it's interesting actually because it was obviously abolished and it was Gordon Brown introduced it. I can't, what was it? It was like 150 million or something back then.
No, it was nothing like that.
Was it 50 million?
No, it was
That's what he said, but they didn't even spend that.
Well, I don't know.
How much did Tower Hamlets
It was.
get?
I know it was very small. I know it was very
How much
small.
did Tower Hamlets get under it?
I don't know, Andrew.
£60,000.
Well, it's
We
not
knew
a
you were
lot,
gonna
so
tell
it
us.
needs to
Made a
be.
huge difference, didn't it?
It needs to be properly resourced, and the argument is immigrants from the EU giving more than they get back. That's very abstract to most people. So if you allocate resources to areas
But
of
the
high
problem,
risk-
just
There's a-
briefly,
yeah.
the problem is that Labour politicians have been saying since 2010 or before that they understand your concerns about
Ed Miliband
immigration.
tried the same approach.
People are fed up with understand, they want action.
Ed Miliband tried the same approach, which is we understand your pain, we feel your pain, and we're going to stop people undercutting wages. And it turns out that is not the entirety of the problem. People either don't believe that what they do is going to work, or actually it's not just about undercutting wages. There is something sort of deeper and more emotional about communities changing, which isn't addressed by money.
Well, we shall see. It looks like it's going to be one of the main themes today, particularly since Home Affairs
Certainly
is
is.
big this morning in the conference. Thanks to you both. Let's go back to Joe in London, because we've been looking at divisions and so on, but there's also been plenty of policy announcements. So we thought we'd put together a daily politics guide, and of course Joko has got all the details.
Yes, thanks, Andrew. Jeremy Corbyn and his team have been doling out policy sweeties this conference like they're going out of fashion. The biggest bounty awarded was John McDonnell's pledge for a minimum wage of £10 or more from 2020. He also scored a conference hit with a plan to ban tax-avoiding firms from winning public sector contracts. Emily Thornberry's guarantee that a future Labour government will make up any shortfall in European funding for the regions went down well with activists. But Shadow Defence Secretary Clive Lewis was fed a gobstopper after his pledge to accept party support for Trident renewal was said to have been removed from his speech just before he went on stage. So instead, he fudged the issue, saying the nuclear weapons system would be renewed as long as it remained party policy. Labour types were keen on Andy MacDonald's proposals to give local communities more control over their bus services and return them to the public sector when possible. One of the most controversial announcements was that a complete ban on fracking, made by Barry Gardiner despite criticism from the GMB union. And today's minty fresh policy announcement comes from Jeremy Corbyn himself, who says there shouldn't be a limit on the numbers of immigrants coming to the UK. Andrew.
Thanks, Joko. Apologies again for the sound here in Liverpool. We've changed the mic, so let's hope that makes an improvement. I'm joined now by the Shadow Secretary of State for International Trade, Energy, Climate Change and Europe. Whew. Barry Gardiner, big title, welcome. After the referendum result, Jeremy Corbyn said that Labour's policy on immigration would need to change to reflect the Brexit vote. How has it changed?
I think what we have to do is we have to make sure that people understand that there is controls on immigration, so that people who are coming to this country feel that the ones who are coming in are benefiting them.
But how would the policy
skills
change?
Well, that it would be making sure that the people who come here have the skills and are able to contribute to our economy in a way that everybody is going to benefit from, and that they are not going to be people who are either displacing people from work here. But the key thing is, I don't think people are, and you referred in the opening piece to numbers. I think people are concerned that there should be controlled immigration so that they can see the benefits
Right, well,
that
let me
coming.
ask you the control. Yeah. What control would Labour have on immigration from the EU?
Well, you're asking me to second guess what we're going to now have in terms of our relationship with the EU. And of course,
Well,
Andrew,
we're going
that's
to be
something
out
that
of the EU, but what controls would Labour have?
Well, we don't know what the relationship that we'll have with the EU is, and this is one of the things the government has to come clean on.
But Jeremy Corbyn,
well, hang on.
Jeremy
No, you've asked
Corbyn's
the
office,
question. Let me
but I'm
answer
not
your
getting
question.
an answer. Jeremy,
well, I'm trying to give you one.
Jeremy
So you're
Corbyn's
talking
office said.
over me,
Jeremy
Andrew.
Corbyn's office said, we are not out to control immigration in terms of numbers. So in terms of numbers, there would be no control in immigration.
No, absolutely. To say there's no control is absolutely wrong, right? Now, let me clearly answer the question that you put. What people need to be able to see is that there are controls over the people who are coming into this country. In a new relationship, this government has not set out whether it would prioritise the passporting of goods and services into a single market, the financial services and legal and other services that we need, or the free movement of people. Now, if it doesn't actually come clean with the British public about what what its red line in the negotiation
Yes.
is. You can't ask
I'm
me...
not asking you about government
but-
policy. I'll be doing that with the government next week. I'm asking about Labour Party policy.
But you're
last
asking
night,
me to tell the future, and I'm explaining to you,
last
Andrew, why I
night,
can't,
Jeremy-
because I don't know what the government's going to negotiate.
But you could have a policy urging them to negotiate for something. That's your job as an opposition that you're meant to be doing. Now, last night, Jeremy Corbyn's office briefed that he was, quote, not concerned about numbers. So if you're not concerned about numbers, what controls would you have on EU immigration?
Quality. Quality control.
How would you judge?
Well, we already have a system for judging. We have Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 4.
Not for EU immigration.
I'm talking about a system for judging. We already have a system for judging in our immigration control system.
For non-EU?
Now, of course, but you're now asking me to say what would it be for the EU. We don't know what the future relationship with the EU is.
No,
That's
but you
the whole point.
but look, if there's an election next year,
Yes.
which your party seems to
Yes,
think
indeed.
there is, you would have to do the negotiations.
Yes,
so
indeed.
therefore you would need to have a policy on immigration
No,
that
we-
you would negotiate.
we would
and I'm
need-
trying to work out what that policy is,
Right.
and answer has so far come there none.
No, you're wrong. Actually, I've given you two answers. You just don't like them. So make a distinction there, Andrew.
So how
The
would
key-
you
no, okay,
control?
if
Let me
you'll
ask you again.
answer
How
you-
would you control immigration?
Okay, I tell you. What we would do, if we were the government next year, we would negotiate a Brexit on the basis that there are certain principles that you remain true to. And one of those is to say that immigration must benefit the people in this country. That means you have quality controls like we already have outside of the EU in terms of Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 4. You would then be able to put those controls in place, and that would be part of our Brexit negotiation. But what I'm saying to you is I can't predict what this government's going to do,
understand that. I'm
and
not
I
asking
don't
you
know
to.
what our colleagues in the rest of Europe are going to be prepared to grant us. That's why I say you have to do this from the point of principle.
So, just to be clear on this, you would have a whole series of controls on EU migration.
What I'm saying to you is I would have quality controls on all migration into this country.
So,
Right? Because what we want and what the British people want is they want to know that if people are coming into the UK, it is going to benefit their lives and not just the people who are coming. Of course, we will always take refugees to
Sure,
this
that's-
country.
that's entirely
That's
separate
entirely
issue. I
separate.
understand
But
that.
when we're talking about economic migration, the economy has to work in the favour of the British people and the British public. And if they see that political parties are prepared to put those controls in place, then I believe, and that they're working to their benefit, then I believe that it's not the numbers that matter, it's actually the quality and the economic benefit that they're bringing.
so when he says he's not concerned about numbers, that is consistent with having substantial controls.
Yes, of course it is.
All right.
Of course it is, because
Andy,
it's quality controls. Quality controls. What you're
with
controlling.
no regard on the numbers.
Look, it's about making sure that the people who are coming here are benefiting our society. Obviously, if more people were coming here than there was employment for, that would automatically be a quality control, but it would also limit numbers. I mean, these are spurious questions. You're trying to trap me into a semantic phrase.
No, I'm trying to
and
find out what your policy is.
And which I've given you.
All right, well,
I've
let's
given
move
you
on.
very clear answer that the controls that we would put in place are quality controls that would actually bring benefits to the
The
British
viewers
people.
will decide if they're clear
I
or
think
not.
they will,
That's for them.
yes.
The Shadow Home Secretary, Andy Burnham, has just announced that he doesn't want to be included in the next Shadow Cabinet because he's going to be running
Yes,
for
indeed.
Mayor of Manchester. He said that Labour voters feel, quote, taken for granted and abandoned because of the failure of the political class to curb immigration. Do you agree with that?
I think Andy's making a very important point, that people do feel that they've been abandoned. They do feel that the forces of globalization that are, meaning that multinational companies move labour across the globe, exploit tax regimes, make sure that they get the benefit instead of the benefit accruing to local people. Local people have seen their jobs go, they've seen all the certainties of place go, so that they used to know that, you know, generations would work in the same factory, the same mine, the same town, and that's disappeared. And what we have to do is we have to be able to show people that there are new jobs, that globalization is something that can be controlled. My own view is that we're more likely to be able to control that by working and cooperating with others around the globe than simply by being in isolation on our own.
Now, yesterday you were part of the announcement that Labour, if it got into power, would ban fracking. There wouldn't be fracking.
Well, I made the announcement, absolutely, 2 days ago. Yeah.
Yesterday, as you made it, a huge tanker arrived at Grangemouth full of shale gas for the petrochemical refinery there. Why is it right to import shale gas from America but not develop our own shale gas?
Well, look, I'm talking about a government in the UK setting regulations for the UK. And what I'm very clear about is that we need to make sure that our energy infrastructure is an energy infrastructure for the future and not for the past. And if you look at President Obama and President Xi just 2 weeks ago, they then ratified the climate change agreement, the Paris Agreement. Last week, the governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, was talking about how there's 5 times more energy, oil and gas reserves identified than we can actually use in the world.
Right.
And therefore, to lock ourselves into an energy infrastructure in the UK, which is going to need to take a return on capital over a 35-year period, at a time when we know we've only got 15 years before we need to see that energy, that fossil fuel energy decreasing, doesn't make a great deal of sense.
But I'll ask again, why is it right to import shale gas from America when we have plenty of shale gas in this country?
I've just given you the answer, because we don't want to lock ourselves into that old technology, and by doing that now, by investing now in that technology, and remember here that this is a technology which George Osborne, when he was Chancellor, gave 75% tax allowances, capital allowances to. The only way they can make it profitable is on the backs of taxpayers in the UK.
What's the average life of a shale gas field?
Well, the average life of shale gas field will be about 3 years.
Right.
And if you look at the shale gas field in
what
Poland, here where we are,
what would be wrong?
Well, let me answer
We are
your
going
question.
to need gas for quite a while, right? We're going to need gas as part of the. Well, I'm trying to get some answers. We will need gas for quite some time.
Yes.
So we're going to have to either produce it ourselves, it's running out in the North Sea, you want to ban fracking, so the only alternative is that in the years ahead we will import more and more gas.
Oh, right. Make a distinction, though, Andrew. Make a distinction between gas and shale gas, okay? Because actually, what we do in this country at the moment is we have more gas that we produce in this country. We actually export 33.8% of the gas that we produce, and we only import 18% from the...
We're running out of gas.
No, I'm sorry, we're not. We've got 5% lower imports of gas last year than we had the year before.
That's because we're using less.
No,
the North Sea gas is running out, isn't it?
Sorry. You know, you make these statements, but you don't listen to the answers. The answer I'm giving you is that actually our production of gas in this country over the past 5 years has increased year on year.
Let me just clarify, because it means everything I've read must have been wrong.
Well,
North Sea gas is not running out.
Eventually, of course, every field will run out, but not in the time frame which we have now, between now and the next 15 years, where if you look at the econometrics report from Cambridge, the Cambridge econometrics report shows that there'll be a 26% reduction in gas demand in this country by 2030. That's why it makes no sense at all to lock us into a fossil fuel shale gas technology subsidized by 75% to 75% of all the capital investment by the British taxpayer.
If we are producing so much gas, why are we importing 15 billion pounds a year of gas?
Because we're exporting more. That's why. Because we actually have well, you're laughing. Do you want to check the figures,
yes,
Andrew? Okay,
I will.
Check the figures, because we are exporting 33.8% of the gas that we produce. We are importing, right? We are importing
15 billion pounds.
1.1 billion cubic meters less, okay, than we're exporting. So in actual fact, The whole point here is that we do need gas, we need natural gas that will take us through, cope with all the intermittencies that renewables have, that will take us through to 2030. We will need gas to do that, and I'm absolutely a supporter of that. What we don't need is to be locking ourselves into a new gas infrastructure, namely shale gas, which is subsidised 3/4 by the British public, okay, by the taxpayer, but which will demand a return over a 35-year period, which takes us beyond that time when actually gas will be diminishing in the system.
You've made that very clear. Thank
Good.
you very
Thank
much.
you.
I think now we're going back to Joe in London.
Thank you, Andrew. And I've been joined in the studio by the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, David Gauke. Welcome to the Daily Politics. Let's get your reaction to some of the policies that have been announced at the Labour conference. Given your stated Remain position during the EU referendum campaign, can we take it you're fully in agreement with Jeremy Corbyn's wholehearted support today for continued freedom of movement between the EU and the UK?
Well, what we've had is a referendum. The British people made a decision. They voted to leave the European Union. You're absolutely right. I was on the other side of the argument, but the British people have made a decision. We have to respect that. And clearly one of the key elements that drove a lot of people to vote to leave the European Union was concerns about migration. And in terms of negotiating our new relationship with the European Union, that needs to reflect that, and it needs to reflect the concerns that the British people have about how free movement of labour has operated.
But you thought
up till
during
now.
the campaign they were wrong, those people, and you are in principle and personally in agreement with Jeremy Corbyn, who doesn't want to limit on the numbers of migrants coming into the UK. That's what you campaigned on, freedom of movement within the EU.
Well, I'm certainly not in agreement with Jeremy Corbyn that we can ignore the voice of the British people. The British people have made a decision. We fought the referendum on the basis of a number of reforms that the previous Prime Minister had negotiated that actually no longer available to us anyway. And it is important in terms of the new relationship with the European Union that we don't just ignore what the British people have said, that the new relationship has to reflect what the British people have said.
Right, but you said on the Treasury report about Brexit during the referendum, which you fronted, said that Britain would be worse off if it limited migration. Are you now saying you were wrong then?
Well, what I'm saying is that in terms of the negotiation, we have got to, one, ensure that we reflect the concerns of the British people in terms of free movement of labour. And secondly, we need to ensure that we have as strong access to those European markets that we can possibly have for both goods and services, and that we don't put in place unnecessary barriers to trade.
Right, so
now,
you don't believe now that Britain will be worse off if it limits migration?
Well, the position that I and others argued during the referendum result was leaving the European Union would make us worse off than we would otherwise be.
But but Britain would be worse off if it limited migration. When you talked and when the Treasury talked about the impact and benefits of immigration, they said, you said, that Britain is better off broadly, economically, as a result of immigration. So you were wrong.
Well, what we've got to have is a migration policy that reflects the fact...
So, no, you've said that it reflects the result, but what I'm trying to say is that actually your personal position was the same as Jeremy Corbyn's.
But respects the result, but also ensures that it works in the best interests of the UK economy.
But you said migration did work in the best interests of the UK economy.
But I think there's a point about ensuring that we've got the right people coming here with the right skills and so on.
So you agree with Barry Gardiner, who's just said we want quality controls on all migration, including the EU. You don't disagree with that?
We're now in a different position than we were before the referendum. What we're hearing from Jeremy Corbyn, as far as I can see, and you know, admittedly, what the briefing we seemed to get yesterday and what Barry Gardiner was just saying don't appear to be terribly consistent. But we'll see what Jeremy Corbyn says.
Well, he did say the numbers don't matter; it's the quality that counts.
Well, I mean, the numbers do matter.
Well,
they do.
Clearly they did
play
for your government in the
part
coalition
of
and subsequently, because actually, David Gauke, you failed completely to control those numbers. So the numbers in the end didn't matter today.
Well, there were a number of steps that we took to reduce those numbers. It remains the case that we have a target to bring those numbers down. Actually, there were aspects of the EU negotiation which were about trying to restrict access to benefits, for example, which I think the public understandably had a lot of concern about. So, I think the idea that Jeremy Corbyn is saying is notwithstanding the way the British people vote, that we essentially do nothing to address this issue of migration, which appears to be the message that he was putting out last night. Whether it is the message he puts out this afternoon, we'll
find out when he gives that speech.
But that, I think, demonstrates he's out of touch with where the British people are.
Right, and as you were, obviously, before the referendum result. Just briefly, before we leave the subject of immigration and migration, the Migrant Impact Fund was scrapped by you. Was that the right decision?
Well, we came to office at a period of time where we had some very difficult decisions to make about the public finances.
Right, well, you got it wrong on immigration because of the impact on communities that you were representing, who felt they were being ignored by politicians, and yet you got rid of that fund.
Well, I think there's a wider issue about the state of the public finances. We inherited the most awful mess. We had to sort that out. We had to make a number of difficult decisions when it came to the public finances. I think
but the idea said it wasn't a priority, and of course it became the priority.
Well, I'm not sure that it was the Migration Impact Fund that was necessarily the priority issue at the referendum.
Something
I think
that was actually going to help communities deal with an increase in immigration.
But I think there were concerns about immigration when that fund was in existence, and there were concerns about it after it had gone. I don't think we should place too much emphasis necessarily on that. What we have to do is ensure that we have got an economy that works for everybody, that those areas aren't left behind.
All right.
But whether that's done through a particular fund or through other means, I think
let's take that phrase,
question.
that a country that works for every one of us and not a privileged few, which is what Theresa May says. You've just said the same thing. And in fact, Labour have won the battle of ideas, never mind the battle of rhetoric in terms of sort of public announcements. Workers on boards, a proper living wage, and Theresa May defining herself by the words that I've just said. We're all socialists now, aren't we?
No.
What was wrong with any of that? I mean, you have copied every single one of those policies.
Well, if you look at what we have done over the last 6 years as a government, we've addressed the public finances in the teeth of Labour's opposition. We've reformed public services and welfare, again in the teeth of Labour opposition. We have cut taxes. We have cut taxes, focused particularly on the lower paid. We've increased the personal allowance of income tax. Not necessarily opposed by Labour, but not something that they did when they were in office.
What about these issues that I've just said? Workers on boards. That was a Labour policy. You've taken it on board. A proper living wage. They've announced, John McDonnell, £10 or more. Are you in agreement with that?
Well, hold on. It was the Conservative government that brought in the national living wage.
Which was an extension of the living wage, which was brought in, the minimum wage, which was brought in by Labour.
But, we did this sometime.
You stole the idea.
Well, hold on. We brought in the national living wage while John McDonnell was still a backbencher in the Labour Party. So we can hardly say that's stealing John McDonnell's idea.
Do you agree with the aspiration of £10 an hour?
Well, I think on the point, you're absolutely right to say we believe in a national living wage.
At £10 an hour?
Well, of course, what you have to do is balance the benefit to low-paid workers with the risks to employment.
Well, George Osborne made that decision unilaterally. He ignored the low-pay commission, so politicians can set the standard.
Hold on.
Well, he did.
When George Osborne made his announcement, he based it on the work that Sir George Bain had done, who was the first chair of the Low Pay Commission, who recommended a link with 60% of median income as the level of the national living wage. Now, that's exactly what we're doing. That's why we've got the number that we have.
So £10 is
wrong? If you like this, we could all pluck numbers out of the air. If we had said £10, he'd go 11.
John McDonnell didn't pluck it out of the air. He said it was based on what people could actually live on, a livable wage, rather than, as you said, a median amount that was actually taken into account of businesses. Is that wrong?
I think he has. I mean, it's an announcement, to be fair, he made this time last year as well, as far as I can see.
Do you agree with it?
In terms of having a national living wage, it was a Conservative government that brought it in. In terms of the level, the judgment following expert advice was on 60% of median income.
Would you like to see it go to £10 an hour by 2020?
Well, I'd like to see if median income is increasing at that level, then the rate would increase. But we have to make a judgment as to the point at which we start to lose jobs. It starts to have a negative impact on people who don't have access to the labour market. We've got an extremely good record at getting people working over the last 6 years.
Yes,
we wouldn't want to jeopardise that.
Right.
And it's a question of finding the right balance.
Well,
so that's, I think, what we're doing.
You said in one of your previous answers that you had addressed the public finances, but actually Where is the evidence for that, given that George Osborne dropped his fiscal rule to reach a surplus before losing his job? And even the IMF have come out to say that fiscal consolidation hasn't actually worked. The world is moving against austerity and moving against your policies.
Well, if you look at what has happened to the public finances, yes, the job is not done. I'd be the first to admit that.
You failed to complete it in the first term of office, and you're still, it's still a work in progress.
As I said, I'm the first to acknowledge we haven't completed the job of eliminating the deficit, but we have demonstrated that we've brought it down very significantly from where it was at a record level. And the point I was making is drawing a divide between what we heard from the Labour Party throughout the last Parliament, is that don't worry too much about borrowing.
Which is what you're doing now.
Well, I know I don't. I wouldn't categorise it in that way.
But you've dropped that key rule to reach a surplus and eliminate the deficit.
Because the circumstances have changed.
Right.
Because of the Brexit vote, we're not going to go chasing after that. We're taking a pragmatic view to this, as we did in the last Parliament.
All right.
But it is still important that we live within our means and get the deficit down.
David Gauke, thank you very much for coming in today.
Just to revert back to the Barry Gardner's interview, where we were talking about the amount of gas that Britain imports or exports, and I was surprised when Mr. Gardner said that we actually exported a lot of gas, that overall we seem to be very strong in that regard. On the latest government figures that I have here, of the official figures, they say the UK has been a net importer of gas since 2004, a net importer of gas, with net imports of gas in 2015 accounting for just over 40% of the total supply of gas. Maybe we're talking about two different things, but that was what I was basing my questions on.